Art Visiting Artists series. We are most grateful to the Anonymous Fund for funding this talk tonight. And we are delighted to welcome back Benjamin Edwards, who first came to Tandem in 2002. He is based in Washington, D.C., and prior to his last visit 3 years ago, he had explored what he called the architecture of suburbia, the structural and design forms found in strip malls, fast food joints, gas stations, motels, and other familiar citadels of consumerism. Accompanying the architecture is what Ben referred to as the iconography of the roadway, those commercial signs, symbols, colors, and artificial elements juxtaposed with the natural scene or environment. In order to gather material for his work at that time, he had taken a number of cross-country automobile trips, searching out the roadside life that exists in a separate channel. And along the way, he had taken photos with his digital camera and kept detailed logs and diaries containing location notes, recording where he stopped, where he stayed, and what he bought. The digital photos were then loaded into his computer, and he subsequently selected various elements of those photos, isolated them, and reduced them into basic geometry found in the subject. The result was a conflated composition which became emblematic of what he referred to as the American consumerist utopia. He had his first solo show in New York in 2001 and received glowing reviews. The New York Times called it an instant classic. Since then, he had a second solo show, which opened last fall, which continued to receive tremendous reviews. His subject matter since that time has continued to develop in intriguing ways, which he will describe tonight. He will take you on a journey which describes his earlier work and what he's done since his last visit to Tandem Press. I would encourage you all to also come by the press at some stage and see the magnificent prints that he is also working on. Please join me in welcoming Ben Edwards.
Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. All right. I'm just going to start right in with the images. And basically the way that I'm going to divide up my talk is in 3 parts. The first part will be covering work leading up to my first show in 2001. The middle part will be covering roughly 2002, 2003. And the third part will be 2004, which was work for my most recent solo show. So this first image is a painting that I did in 1996. And I was in graduate school at the time. And it was really kind of the first piece that I did that was different. Previous to this, I had been working somewhat photorealistically, and this was the first time that I'd really started to work with geometric elements and taking photographs and reducing the shapes down into geometry and then doing this kind of compiling to arrive at a composition. So just briefly, the way that I made this painting was I took a bus trip, Greyhound bus trip from New York to San Francisco and back, and took about 200 or 300 photographs along the way, not knowing exactly how I would use the photographs when I got back to the studio. And when I got back to the studio, I just started sort of working pretty traditionally from these photographs. But then I decided that what I was really interested in were just the geometry and the signage that I had seen along the way and occurred in these photographs. So I started reducing the geometry down and just leaving out everything else, and then compiling them frame by frame, exactly where they occurred in the picture frame, putting them in the canvas so that the canvas was like a screen. Things would get projected onto it and then layered from the beginning of the trip to the end of the trip. So from the very beginning, the painting was on a deterministic course that sort of developed as a system, and I didn't know how it would end, but it had a sort of rule-based procedure that it would end in a certain way. Next. Also in graduate school in 1997, I started just driving around the city that I lived in, Providence. I was going to Rhode Island School of Design at the time, and taking photographs of places like gas stations and fast food restaurants, and writing down information about where they were in the city, and then taking all that information back to the studio and making these very elaborate hand-drawn maps showing you the locations of where things occurred. Next. This was a piece that Paula described a little bit called Consumption Log, where covering a 6-month period, also in Providence, I would write down everything that I bought and where I bought it, how much it cost, date, time, etc. And this turned out to be a couple hundred places. And the rule that I had for this, and I was making a painting that was concurrent with this project, whenever I consumed something from a standardized place, I would take a snapshot of the place and it would go into a painting. So that's what you'll see in the next slide. This is one of the works on paper that I made that was from that consumption log. So this was a Home Depot. So what I would do is just, in order not to start composing it too much, I would just walk out to wherever my car was in the parking lot, or just get at an appropriate distance just to get the store in the shot, take a snapshot, and then do this kind of reduction in the studio of tracing out the architecture or signage or parts of the landscaping or asphalt, things like that. Next. So also at this time, the paint was getting more textured, and I was using things like landscaping foam, which is used for architectural models, to give it this kind of quality of being as fake as possible. And I felt that the fakeness was more realistic than actually trying to sort of illusionistically depict the place. Next. So this is a Kentucky Fried Chicken, obviously. And there were about 50 of these that I started making. Next. So then what I did is took this sheet of Mylar and just put it over these drawings and started tracing out parts of the places that I thought were contributing to some kind of sense of structure or a coherent place, that all of these different places that I'd consumed from could be sort of conglomerated into one place, almost as if there was just one gigantic mega merger. Next. So this is the painting that resulted from that, and this painting was about 6 feet by 9 feet. And again, using a lot of texture mixed in with the paint or applied sort of on top. There's no collage or anything, but to do the landscaping foam, for example, I would put on a very thin layer of glue, and then I would pump the foam particles into the glue so that it actually adhered to the surface of the painting. And then sometimes paint over that and really just layer the whole thing. So this painting was made along with that drawing as I was consuming from these places. So I would have the consumption experience. I would write it down on my list. I would take the snapshot. I'd go to the studio. I'd make the drawing, and then I would try to figure out how to get that into this place. And an interesting thing that was happening was this was also when I was in graduate school and was going to be in my thesis show, and I had to finish the painting, and I realized there was really no mechanism for me to finish it. In other words, I would keep consuming and I would keep adding, and it could just theoretically go on and on and on. So I decided that once I caught up to myself, in other words, I'd taken all of those drawings that I had made and incorporated them into this painting, at that point I would be done. So what started happening was I would, instead of going to a Home Depot, I would go to a mom and pop hardware store just so that I wouldn't have to put another Home Depot in the painting. Likewise, I would go, once I went to Taco Bell specifically just to get purple in the painting because there was no purple. So I thought that sort of interplay between real life and making art was interesting. Next. After that project, I graduated from RISD and decided that I wanted to go to Seattle. I'd never been there, and I thought a good way to see the whole city would be to visit every single Starbucks that I could locate in Seattle, which turned out to be about 87 or 88. This is a detail of the map that I made just showing the downtown area, but they really spread out to the whole suburban area of Seattle. So I spent about 3 days driving around taking pictures of every Starbucks location in Seattle. Next. And then this is the painting that resulted from that, about 4 feet by 6 feet. And with this painting, I really started to get much, much more involved with the texture. The paint was getting really, really thick, and things were layering on top of each other. At some points, the thickness got up to be about 1/8 of an inch or so, using all kinds of gels and pumice mixed in with the paint to get a kind of asphalt look, and doing a sort of faux brick and Spanish tile effect. And I really thought of this painting as like either the ideal Starbucks, the perfect Starbucks, the average Starbucks, almost as if you could take all of them and sort of compress them back into one place again. Next. And then in 1998, after that project, I got a PC and a digital camera and started keeping this archive of places that I had experienced, either driving by or just going there shopping or whatever. And I wanted this sort of virtual place, this kind of place to put all this data. And so I started up a website and put all of my archiving information on the website. So this was just a page from that showing my kind of cataloging system with the numbers and my shorthand code for the place and the GPS coordinates and the time. Next. This was the main directory page from the site. So if you clicked on one of the little icons there, you would go either to a chronological archive or you'd go to an archive of, say, all the Home Depots that I collected, which will be on the next slide right here. So this is really a way for me to kind of organize all this stuff for myself. I didn't really expect that people would want to go see every Home Depot that I'd seen, but it was a way for me to organize the information and to have it there as sort of a backdrop of information that would be there for my paintings. Next. So I just started making drawings after that in a similar way that I'd done before, trying to arrive at an idea of a structure of if these places all combined into one kind of merger, and doing experiments with that. Next. And that all led up to this painting, which was from 2000 and 2001. Very large painting, about 8 feet by 12 feet. And the places that I'd used for this were all from around the Washington, D.C. area, the suburbs in Virginia and Maryland. And I think it ended up being probably about 300 different places that I collected, and used Photoshop to sort of plan out how I would make the painting, but not in a way that I would make the image first and then paint it. It was really more of kind of a back and forth. So Photoshop really was kind of a structural tool to sort of plan the overall composition, but in the actual details of what I was painting, that would be unknown to me, and it would sort of develop as I made it. And this painting I really thought of as like the bigger, badder version of Conglomerate, the painting I had done a couple years previous. And this was also sort of at the height of the booming economy, and I just thought of this as sort of the ultimate place of gravitational pull, as if everything just sort of smushed into one super place. Next. This is a detail of that center part of the painting. Next. The project that I did after that was in 2001 and was based on a trip to Los Angeles that I made. What I did was I sort of plotted a course around the edge of Los Angeles. Actually turned out to be Los Angeles County, which turned out to be about 500 miles, and took photographs along this route of houses and housing developments and office parks and strip malls and things like that. And getting into the studio and taking all of this information, the sort of system that I came up with was to start from the photographs that were from the beginning of the trip journey and put them in a smaller format in the center of the canvas, and then with each new photograph the size of the format would increase just very, very slightly in 1/8 inch increments or something like that, so that with each picture the format got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I didn't want to just accumulate and layer things as I had done in the previous painting. I wanted a more subtractive kind of system. So my rule for this was that when a shape would layer over another shape, instead of just going on in full color, it would, where that overlap occurred, there would be this kind of erasing that happened. So I'd put on this very, very thin canvas colored paint, this sort of glaze. And as that accumulated, what started to happen was that the center of the painting would erase itself, get obliterated, and the edges of the painting would be in full color and very pristine. And I like the way that sort of mirrored a process that happens in a city, where the inner core may get decayed and the outer suburbs are new and the paint is fresh and the colors are bright. This painting was really inspired by an article that I had read in the LA Times back in '96 when I was living in LA about the lengths that commuters would go to. What was the farthest point that someone would live outside of the city? And it turned out to be about 45 minutes, and I was interested in that. Where is that sort of outer limit? Next. This was a companion piece, a much smaller painting, the same scale as that original rectangle in the previous painting. And this was kind of like the trash compactor painting. Everything that got discarded from the previous painting would then get layered and smushed and compressed into this painting. So it became very, very thick and accumulated and dense. Next slide. This was a digital project that I did. This was all work from my solo show in 2001. And this is a piece called Value Link, based on a computer program that I wrote that would fragment the web browser into 5 different frames. And each frame would go off randomly to a different website. And then I would take screenshots and compile them all together. And so this is sort of my idea of what your computer monitor might look like if it was, really, really massive, or if your web browser could handle hundreds of different websites all at one time, sort of trying to smush everything into this, very narrow, or not a very narrow conduit, increasing the size of the conduit, which would then sort of increase the amount of information that you would get. Next slide. Okay, and now I'm picking up from where I left off the last time I was here. This is in 2002. My last visit to Tandem was in March of 2002, and I had just come back from a trip to South Korea, where I was commissioned to do a painting based on the city of Busan. And so this painting was made in the summer of 2002. And at this time, I was starting to use a 3D modeling program called TrueSpace. And this painting is really a bridge between my old way of working, just working from photographs and tracing out geometry, and my new way of working, which is to make three-dimensional models based on the photographs, and then to take renderings and use that as the source for the paintings. And I was able to get a much better control of the space that I was working in, and really able to kind of just get a better sense of what I was after. So, next slide. Okay, and now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and go into the middle section of the talk, and this is 2002 and 2003. After finishing the painting for the Korean Commission, I was also thinking about a project that would be a little bit more something that would give me a larger sort of umbrella project, rather than just jumping from painting to painting and very specific geographically based project from one to the next. And I started to develop this idea of a virtual city, or an ideal city. And this is sort of a semi-simulation that I made on the computer that sort of grew a city based on a set of rules that I wrote. So it's kind of like SimCity, but as if SimCity could make its own city on its own, rather than you having to make it. And this later became what I called Automatic City. Next slide. So I started to think about how I would take all of this these three-dimensional objects that I was modeling, and how to start to make places out of them. I didn't want to just make a model of a place and then paint it, to have that kind of one-to-one relationship. I wanted to break things down and then build them back up into something completely new and recycled, and something familiar yet completely different. And so I started to make these drawings that would sort of explore how I might go about doing that. Next. So they were mostly just these kind of generic cube-like structures, architecture using various things that I had made models of, and just kind of compressing them into these cubes. Next. And then I started to think about, what my ideal city plan might look like, that I could start inserting these new architectures that I was making into this place that would be sort of a generator to make paintings from. So I came up with this model. Next, please. But I felt that was a little too rigid and stilted, and I was really inspired by this print by Piranesi of ancient Rome, and the kind of organic quality of how things were butting up against each other, and at different angles, and which seemed a much more accurate way of how older cities really kind of developed organically. Next slide. So I came up with this structure, this sort of bare bones city plan that I could then start filling in with various things, and start to actually grow a city organically, rather than start out with a geometry that was kind of preset. Next slide. So I started taking these historical sources, plans from architecture books that were usually based on something that was somewhat famous or well known, but other times not so well known, and tracing these shapes out, putting them on transparencies, and then just starting to organize them into patterns, and using that as my material to start growing the city. Next slide. And then further refining that down into a kind of a sense of place, and what this place might become. And I was starting to think more politically about, maybe what would this kind of American city-state look like from the eyes of someone 2,000 years from now, imagining what our current time looks like. So this kind of very ceremonial, grand place. Next slide. This was a 3D model that I made using those plans. So all along, with these models, I was imagining these structures as sort of molds or forms that I would start to insert these architectural fragments into and start to construct this place. And so the paintings would be from a viewpoint within that model somewhere. Next slide. So this was an early experiment with one of those structures, starting to fill it up with objects that I'd modeled from the sort of everyday vernacular architecture from commercial places and housing developments and just kind of the junk we normally see in out on the road. Next slide. Also at this time I was taking not just historical plans but historical references from architecture books. Palladio, Mies van der Rohe, various kinds of iconic architectural forms, and making models of them, and then also breaking them down into parts and objects, and then rebuilding them back up, fragmented into something new. And so I did a series of works on paper that kind of applied that method. Next, please. So these were sort of these just cube-like structures that had some semblance to classical architecture, but were, these kind of pitiful attempts at trying to be classical. And they weren't classical in any way, but just sort of, just kind of random. Next. And I made hundreds of these, what I called modules, and I was planning on using them as building blocks to start to build these pyramids that would reference this classical architecture. Next slide. This was a digital print that I made in the spring of 2003, and you can see in that large pyramid structure how those blocks would get built together to form this gigantic structure. This is an image of what this place might look like from a distance as it was sort of in the process of building. So this is the same model that I showed earlier with the sort of bird's eye view. This was a digital print, not a painting. Next. This is a painting of one of those, of a sort of a view within one of those streets from that model. And I was getting farther and farther along with filling up these blocks with contemporary architecture, office park architecture, and sort of townhouses and apartment buildings. And this time I was also inspired by New Urbanism, which tries to, it's also called neo-traditionalism, and tries to take a historical kind of aesthetic, or a traditionalist kind of aesthetic, and apply it to city planning and make spaces which are pedestrian friendly and not on the scale of the automobile but on the scale of the individual person, and trying to sort of come to grips with my feelings about that, and because I really like the idea behind it, and I sort of applaud the gesture, but at the same time, when I go to these places and I actually walk around and experience it, it always feels kind of like slightly like Disneyland, and so I was very conflicted about it. And so this painting was a way for me to try to work out some of those issues. Next. Also, in the summer of 2003, I started making some works on paper of what these individual structures would look like along the street, and also starting to incorporate some material from the internet and some more computer type content into the space, almost like an ether that is filling the air that you may not necessarily see when you're walking down a street, but it's kind of sort of information, sort of pervading the space. Next. And I also started coming up with these sort of nonsense names for the places, along with taking photographs of buildings. I would collect names of like a gated community, an office park, or a mall, or something like that. And then I would break them down and then rebuild them back up. So this one was called Alternate Crossings, which doesn't mean anything, doesn't come from anywhere. It's just kind of this hybrid manufactured name. Next slide. This one's Verifone Palms. Verifone actually turns out to be something real. It's when they call in your credit card to verify that it's the right number. So next slide. Next slide. Okay, now I'm going to get to part 3 and sort of jumping back a little bit. I was getting felt like I was getting a little bit too far afield, trying to bite off more than I could chew with all of this. Next slide. So I went back to my archive and started up a new website and started really getting out, taking photos and really collecting stuff to make something. Next slide. And I developed this system of these series of archives where I would refine the information down, much as I had showed in the beginning of the lecture, taking icons and graphics and sort of making them computer ready, ready to be used in kind of a virtual environment. So I'd take web pages and elements from the landscape and graphics and just kind of get them properly reduced down to be used to build something. Next slide. So I started making these small paintings. These are about 19 by 26, imagining the space that I wanted to build as much more virtual and not so kind of rooted in these historical references. Sort of separating this interest in the historical with the interest in the more technological and kind of contemporary material. So I started throwing these elements, these fragments into the space, and imagine what this place might look like. Next slide. Almost as if you were able to sort of navigate through your computer's hard drive, and started using text that you would see on websites, as well as computer code, virus code, cookies, which are the little text things that a website will implant on your hard drive so that next time you visit that site, they'll know who you are, and which when you look at them, they're just sort of this gibberish. Next slide. That text there in the foreground is from a cookie. And these were pretty much just straight, not changing them around too much. So you see the big Windows icon up there in the upper left, and there's Clear Channel and all kinds of references, which are, for me anyway, pretty recognizable, pretty straightforward. Next slide. Next. So I started to get kind of bored with just throwing things in there that were kind of straightforward, and I wanted to do the same thing that I was doing with the architecture, break these icons down and then build them back up into some new hybrid thing. So that's what I started doing. I called these anti-icons, and I sort of thought of them as fictional logos, or maybe future logos that you might see 10 years from now for some company that doesn't exist yet. And there are things in there which, sometimes are recognizable, sometimes are obscure, like the pink rings are from the T-Mobile hotspot graphic that you'll see if you go to Starbucks or something like that. Next. So this one has a little bit of Intel, a little bit of BP. There's like the Sports Authority figure back there somewhere. Also, there was a lot of these kind of orbits or swooshes and, you know, spheres like planets kind of orbiting. Next. This one, the little guy in the center there was from a pharmaceutical ad. There are a lot of pharmaceutical ads that have little people kind of being happy. Collected a lot of those. Next. I like this one a lot because it's kind of like, it tells you to do something, but you're not really sure what it's telling you to do. I guess this means like download, you know, and the arrows pointing in different directions. And next. So these are some computer prints that I made that were using that material, kind of throwing them into this virtual space, which became more and more congested and a little more sophisticated from what I had done with the paintings. So you see some of those anti-icons floating around, and you know, I was collecting a lot of spam and putting them in there, and just kind of seeing what would happen when all these layers of information would start to accumulate. And I wanted to get this sense of deep space, like you were standing there looking through all of this junk. Next slide. And these were computer prints that I was making in order to develop material to make a painting. Next. And I wanted to give myself lots and lots of different options, lots of possibilities for elements to paint. And I'll show you that in a second. One more slide. Next. And these were kind of based on a system of rules for where things would get placed, but also within that system, certain kind of randomness. So it's kind of a pattern that's been in my work of having this mix of order and chaos, having something ordered enough so that I have a generalized sense of what something will be, but in the details of that, it's totally up to chance. And that gives me, it's a good way to generate you know, something that I have a vague sense of what I want, but I don't know exactly what I want until I see it. Next slide. So this is a day-by-day animation of how I used all of that information and layered it into a painting. Each one of these split-second frames was a day, and this is about 82 or 83 days that it took to make the painting. So I was keeping this digital version of what I was doing as a way to plan out the painting along with making the painting in the studio. So there was a very close relationship from one to the other. So again, not using the computer to just plan out the whole thing in advance and then paint it, but to really use it as a tool in the studio to develop something one step at a time. So this is the, actually next slide please. This is the painting that resulted from that. It's not, you can't really tell the difference too much in this because it's, you know, just a projection, but the painting itself did have a lot of texture added into the paint. For example, that sort of shrub there on the lower left was made by using little chopped up fake plants. I'd chop them up into little fine pieces and then apply the glue and then apply the little fake plant mixture to the glue. Same thing with the flowers and there's a patch of dirt in the lower right. So it's had a very kind of physical, tactile sense to it. This painting was about 6 feet by 10 feet or so. Next slide. This is all work that went into my most recent show in 2004, last November. I also wanted to focus not so much on that kind of virtual space of, you know, standing on that road, but I wanted to develop a full range of architecture that would start to fill this virtual place. And for the houses, what I did was I went to, actually I ordered it over Amazon, but you can get it by going to Staples or CompUSA or whatever. This very kind of rudimentary 3D home architect software that people would use to, redesign their house or plan an addition or whatever they use it for, which is kind of very, somewhat sophisticated, but not as sophisticated as a true 3D modeling program. And I would use it to kind of generate all of these possibilities that they give you of, wall colors and styles and whatever. And then I would import that into my normal 3D program and really kind of take it from there and get it to be a lot more sophisticated. Next slide. So I started making as many different combinations of these houses as I could make to try to fill up this landscape. And this is all kind of leading up to a painting that would show kind of a bird's eye view of this city. So you'd see hundreds of these houses in the landscape. Next slide. Next. And also you might notice they're kind of escalating. These were kind of finished digital images that I made, taking the best elements of all of the houses, and I made small house, medium, large, and then next one's extra large. Next slide. And then this was the painting that resulted from using all of those houses. And you can see the angle that was used, the camera angle was distorted, so that if you were standing on this corner, you'd be able to look down both sides of the street, which is really a 90-degree angle, but because of the distortion of the lens, you're able to see both ways, which also kind of distorted the structure at the same time. And this painting is just called House. It's kind of medium-sized, about 3.5 feet by 5 feet. Next slide. Another project that I was doing for the show was to get a list of the top corporations in America, and then going to a website called TerraServer. And actually, I think Google now, you can get satellite images on Google as well. But if you type in the GPS coordinates of the place that you want to look up, they'll give you this digital image. So I was able to track down where the corporate headquarters were for all kinds of corporations, and then get a nice satellite image of their headquarters. So this one's ExxonMobil. Next, General Motors. Next slide. And then this was one of my favorites because it's Merck, which is a pharmaceutical company, and their building is shaped like a cell. There's a lot of funny ones like that. Next. Another feature with TerraServer is that you can actually use this dimensioning tool. So you could measure, you could get a really, really high resolution image, and then you could measure how big the buildings are. And from the shadows, I could get a pretty good idea of how tall the buildings were. So that enabled me to start making three-dimensional forms that were based on these satellite images. Next. So this is a painting that resulted from all of that information, taking those forms and kind of applying this generic corporate skin of glass and, kind of chrome or whatever, and applying it to these forms, and then imagining this sort of super corporate entity that's kind of just floating there. Next slide. This is one of the larger paintings in the show, and this isn't actually a finished painting. I'm going to show you a sort of frame-by-frame development of how the painting came to be. But this is also what we're working on at Tandem right now, the same material. So this structure was made using those cubes that I had showed earlier from the historical references. Next slide. And each one of these frames is going to show you how what I did with the painting to sort of develop this space. So the colored squares are from that simulation program that I had made, which I just sort of froze and took that to be, this virtual city that had developed. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, there's something strange there. Next slide. Okay, there we go. Then I started to develop this structure in the sky, and I'll just kind of, as we go along, I'll point out some of these architectural references. But I really thought of this as sort of a failed utopian theme park, or sort of a dream of utopia, or ideas about power, or sort of power meditating on itself. This reference was from Le Corbusier's Radiant City design that he had planned to completely demolish the core of Paris and put up these towers instead. Next, please. This dome was the dome that was designed by Speer for Hitler, which for the New Berlin, after Hitler was victorious, and it was supposedly big enough to hold, I think it's 16 times the size of the U.S. Capitol, and could hold 3 St. Peter's basilicas inside. I think I have that right. Anyway, it was enormous. Next slide. Next slide. This was a model that I had made based on a Hugh Ferris rendering of a skyscraper design showing the sort of zoning envelope of what a maximized skyscraper would look like in New York according to the zoning laws in 1916. Next slide. It might be hard to see that, but that structure that went in the center there is from the proposed model for the Palace of the Soviets monument to Lenin. Next slide. The 2 spires that are on the left and the right. On the left side is the sort of iconic emblem of the 1939 World's Fair in New York City. And on the right is Frank Lloyd Wright's Mile High Skyscraper. So some of these are projects that were never built. Some things were built but destroyed. Next slide. And the final piece of architecture going across the horizon line is from the Nazi Party rallying grounds. So it's really a mix of capitalist, communist, Soviet, and Nazi architecture, all kind of revolving around the year 1939 or so, give or take. Next slide. And this was the painting that resulted. So you can see all of the houses and other structures filling up the landscape, and that sort of super corporate headquarters occupying the center. All of the material there in the road is coming from the same material that I used to make the painting that I showed you the animation of. So this painting really kind of tied all of those things together. And I really thought of this as sort of ideas about power sort of floating as this kind of ghostly thing that's hovering above everything. And this city that I was trying to imagine, I kind of think of it as a colony, or some extension of where we are as a country right now. And also kind of contrasting the sort of very mundane what's happening down in the landscape of just the sort of American dream of everyone building their sort of dream house, and then the kind of utopian dreams that kind of dominated the 20th century. And I believe that's the last slide, so can we go to the next one and just, yeah. So that's it. Thank you. Take questions? Yeah, I can take questions if anybody has any.
Can you talk about how you feel you relate to various histories in painting, specifically eras or styles of painting that you absorbed and sort of reconstituted in the imagery that you're working with now and the scale that the work is operating at?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the sort of inspirations for that final image came from Thomas Cole's Voyage of Life series. I think it's 4 paintings, and the one that came from was one called Youth, where the sort of protagonist in the series is sort of holding up his hand and reaching for this kind of magical kingdom in the sky, this kind of ideal. But Thomas Cole in general has been, specifically like the Course of Empire paintings, have been very important for me. And mostly what I look at now is not so much contemporary painting, but painting that kind of happened before the abstract expressionists sort of changed everything. A lot of painting that's been forgotten or that you don't see very much in art history books because it doesn't fit in with the kind of narrative of how art history has gone. And it's kind of a difficult issue for me to talk about because I don't really know how I'm using it. I know that I'm interested in 18th century painting, Italian painting like Canaletto, or 19th century painting is very interesting for me, or even like the paintings from the 30s of the Soviet socialist realist paintings are interesting, but it's hard for me to articulate why they're important for me or how I see them kind of fitting into what I want to do. But I do know that there's this whole pre-20th century story of art history that I'm finding a lot more interesting now than I'm finding pop art, for example, or which are kind of the well-worn stories that I learned about in school. And so I'm starting to go back to the stuff that was kind of neglected and I'm finding very interesting.
It seems like there was a real obvious link to like Malevich, Mondrian, Nolan, Ellsworth Kelly, Larry Coons,
Mm-hmm.
even in those sort of mechanical paintings. I mean, is that a conscious, sort of moment in time or a strain of philosophy that you see yourself using specifically?
Yes, and I think like Malevich, for example, I was very conscious when the first painting that I showed, I almost thought of it as like, if you took contemporary architecture and signage and you, what would that look like if Malevich got a hold of it? And that's how I was thinking of my paintings at that time. And also early Cubism and Futurism. And I mean, it's a very exciting time of what was happening in the early 1900s and up until when World War I happened. It's a very dynamic time. And I think that I reference, specifically Futurism, I reference consciously because of the way that, of the parallel that it has to today's world where, especially in the 90s where technology was kind of like, we had this sort of, ideas about a technological utopia and it was just in the air. And I was referencing Futurism very consciously because of that. I think it's changing for me now as we're kind of entering new territory, and I don't know how to talk about it so much.
Have you been at all tempted to do interiors?
Like a mural or something?
No,
Like,
well, no, but I mean views of interiors or.
oh, as a,
everything that you're doing is pretty much landscape.
Right,
and
right.
Maybe looking inward, but.
I've thought about that and how I might do it, and I think it's a big challenge, and I don't see myself doing it anytime soon, but maybe someday I can figure that out.
What's your favorite place?
City?
Place?
Any place?
Yeah.
Well, my favorite city is probably New York. I don't know. I mean, I guess my favorite place. I'll give you an example of a place that I'm always trying to when I'm in these sort of spaces and I'm experiencing architecture, and I really try to not just be kind of knee-jerk critical, and I'm trying to look for things that work, you know. And I don't know if I live in Washington, D.C., and this is, you know, just kind of a small example, but if you go down to the National Gallery of Art new sculpture garden, I think that's really well done. You know, it's an example of something that's kind of classical and also contemporary. And I see a lot of architecture that's, you know, trying to grapple with those two things and not doing it very successfully. So that's a nice place to go. But you know, cities, I like New York, I like Paris, San Francisco.
Is there anything beyond painting's capability to create texture and physicality that you feel it needs to be part of your process as opposed to just leaving it in the digital or printout realm?
Is there something that painting can do that digital can't do, you mean?
Besides the texture.
Besides the texture?
You feel needs to be a part of the process to fully realize the idea that you're going for.
Well, I don't know if this qualifies as texture, but just the kind of tactile sense of something having been made and sort of accumulated and not just flat on a computer monitor, which you can feel in just about any painting. I mean, even if it's, you know, pretty flat, you get a sense of someone having been there in front of that thing and actually made it. And what I like to see in paintings is kind of, you know, residue and accumulation that happens, because you get a sense of time, you know, the time that the artist took to make it, and which is so kind of opposite of so many of the images in our culture, and, you know, photographs and digital. You don't really get a sense of something being real because you don't have that kind of physical sense. So. Okay. Thank you.
Very much. Please join me in thanking Ben.
What time is it?
6:30.
An hour. See? There we go.
I guess we need to switch off your